Welcome back, everybody. Today we're going to be working on Unit 4, and we're going to do a little bit of a paradigm shift here, and that is we're going to be moving away from our main textbook. That doesn't mean that it's not going to be pertinent to us. We still will pull materials from there, and I still encourage you to read the chapters that correspond with some of the things that we're going to talk about in this unit. And basically what we're going to do here is we are going to build various little applications from this tutorial document, and you can see that I have it linked up here right in the topic list, so go ahead and grab a copy of that. We will be working through that document pretty much cover to cover. There's maybe a couple things that we skip over, and a couple of areas are kind of informative more than functional, but it is basically a complete set of tutorials covering every major aspect of MVC within a .NET environment. And the feedback I've gotten from students the last few semesters that I've used it has been very positive. And I think it's done a little bit better than our book. Of course, I'll be adding in my own little thoughts about it as we go, so kind of like lecture-y stuff as we work through the tutorials. This semester, of course, this is the fall of 2019. I am using Visual Studio 2019 to do the work. So one of the reasons I'm kind of like re-recording the tutorials is just for those that are maybe using this version of the software. For those of you using either 2017 or 2015, you may actually opt to use my archive videos. And you'll see that as I list them, I say which semester I used and which software I used. And that way you can kind of backtrack without really losing too much. The assignments in this unit are basically completing the tutorials in that document and screenshotting them. As I always offer up with these types of assignments, you know, the screenshots for me are enough to show me that you're doing the work, provided that they're thorough enough. So you want to make sure you take an ample amount of screenshots of your code and the application running to show me that it's actually working. But as a backup, you guys should always consider zipping up your work and also uploading that, just in case you get into that situation where maybe, you know, your machine dies or you lost your files, or you overwrote a version or something like that. You don't want to be in that situation. So I always offer that up as a really good backup mechanism. At this point in time, I'm hoping you guys have strategies for backing up your files. And I feel like I'm saying this in all of my classes. I shouldn't say it to third and fourth semester students like you guys as much. But with, you know, first semester people, I have to remind them constantly, back up your work, back up your work. If you're going to start something fresh today, make a version of what you did so that you can go back to where you were, just in case you screw things up. The unfortunate thing is with these technologies, sometimes it's easier to just like kind of scrap what you did and start over than it is to try to fix it. Not that it's not fixable, but a lot of times the fixing techniques are a little more complicated because we're working with programs that are stitched together with little pieces as opposed to working on like one big code file. So you got code files everywhere, you got web pages everywhere, you're not sure what's feeding into what, so sometimes you're better off just, you know, starting from scratch again and building rather than trying to fix what's broken. Visual Studio does a pretty decent job of giving you like feedback as things are broken. But one thing you always have to remember with like output error lists from any program or debugging tool, always start with the first error and work your way down. Don't ever start at the bottom of the list, because sometimes that first error is what's generating all the rest of them. So that's just a helpful piece of advice. So don't try to grab the ones you think are easy fixes. Start top down, because, you know, things kind of cascade, frankly. All right, I'm going to go ahead and pull that document up on the screen, and I'm going to just narrow it up for right now. And this is a tutorial that's put together by a group of people known as Tutorials Point, Simply Easy Learning. And they have a bunch of different stuff out there, so I encourage you to patronize them if you like this particular document. I think it's a pretty effective one at showing the techniques. And they have tutorials on a lot of other different subjects as well. The difference here is, you know, like you guys could go out and do this tutorial on your own online and learn a lot of the same stuff, but it's not guided. So you don't have somebody there holding your hand or answering your questions if things aren't working right. And that's what I think the advantage is of taking the course here. Plus you earn credit and you earn a degree, so that helps as well. All right, so let's like dive into the document and just do a really quick overview of it. Now, you're going to notice that they have some chapters here where they talk about much of the same things that we've already covered in class, including where MVC came from, what it's all about, what are the benefits of it. And what I'm going to do right now is I am going to rifle through that material, but it's going to be really fast. Okay, so I'm not trying to repeat all the stuff that I did the first couple weeks of class. But sometimes I think from a perspective of learning something new, it's not a bad idea to see how other people talk about it, to see if maybe there's like a gap that they're filling in that maybe the other book didn't fill in quite so well. So I'm just going to fast forward here through these various things. And you can see there's a lot of different aspects to this. And so they talk about what this technology is relative to some of the other technologies that you've learned. So if you took the first ASP.NET class, we worked with a thing called web forms and user controls. I hope you guys remember all those things. And so we were working on the right side of this box. Another big branch of working in .NET is working with MVC. So when you get more complicated, robust applications, most developers start to opt for going to more robust structures where you don't have to repeat a lot of the work that you're creating. And that's really the advantage of MVC. Remember, the other big convention or thing about MVC is convention over configuration. You've heard me say that a few times. Or the dry principle, where you're not repeating yourself. Don't repeat yourself. That's what it stands for. And MVC is really good at that, because you're not really building, once you create an interface, why do you have to recreate it? You don't, right? You learn how that applies with master pages and other things like that, but MVC kind of takes it up a few notches. All of this sits on top of the .NET frameworks. There's kind of layers to this thing, which ultimately then compiles down to Windows. All right, so they talk about some of the libraries and where it came from. It hasn't really been around that long in terms of ASP.NET. Keep in mind, though, that the whole concept of MVC actually stretches back to the late 70s. And I always like to give kudos to the people back then that were smart enough back then to see the usefulness of all this. So what is MVC all about? It's about the model view controller architecture. And here's some of the benefits. I'm sure you guys can read that for yourself. So that was a very quick chapter, right? So I told you I would go fast. So let's talk about the MVC pattern a little bit. They do give the kudos back to the thing model view editor thing back in 1979. And I think that's fascinating that it really goes back that far. All right. No matter how you learn these technologies, there are some things that obviously you're going to have to think about. Now, at first, when you learn this, we start with the M, the model part of it, and what you're going to see, within a few weeks here is how that really kind of actuates itself, because the model is kind of the part that ties us to the data. And I always tell students that often you don't really have a true application until you're tying to some sort of a data source or repository, whether it's a database or a text file or what have you. And the model, it's kind of a weird thing because it's not actually the data. It's kind of like an abstraction of the data, if you will. So sometimes it does connect you to a database, but really what it does is it tries to create a logical construct for the data so that you can utilize it in your application. The view, of course, is what the user sees, and the controller is what kind of directs all the action in the application, and you guys have been kind of seeing that. And you're also learning that the controller is really big on being able to control the application via the URL. That's kind of an interesting aspect of it as well. It also leads to nice, clean URLs, which I think is kind of a positive. All right. All right, in this section, of course, they go through installing Visual Studio. You can see what versions they were dealing with when they created this. They're actually back on 2012, so it is a little bit dated. But the concepts do apply just fine to all the current technologies. They are using MVC4 when they first put that in there. And they do point out a tool here that I think is kind of interesting. So I'm actually going to click on this link, not really knowing where it's going to take me. I'm just really curious more than anything, because I see that they're pointing to Microsoft's Web Platform Installer. Okay. And if you actually look that up, I'm going back to the document here. So if you actually Google this and then pull that up in a separate tab, there's a few different versions of this. And I just would like to explain what this tool is. It's a tool that you use to add stuff to other Microsoft development tools. So if I'm working in Visual Studio, perhaps, or I'm doing stuff in some other, similar types of environments, maybe Visual Studio Code, SQL Server, for example, and there's additional tools you might want to add. That's actually a tool that allows you to add the things as opposed to going to the installer that's attached to the product. And then it gives you other capabilities. They mention it in here because in the old versions of Visual Studio, there were some tools that you could not pull in by going to the NuGet Manager or through the installation options of Visual Studio. And this was provided as a way to be able to add those things in. And unfortunately, when certain versions of MVC would come out, sometimes they were out before they were included in Visual Studio. So if you wanted to add MVC4 to Visual Studio 2012, especially the original versions, you had to bring it in with this tool. So that's what that's about. So don't get confused by that. You don't have to do that, obviously. The fascinating things is notice what version of Visual Studio they're talking about here, and then notice what version they're actually running here, which is the Community 2015 version. And for those of you not in the know, I have been strongly recommending the Community version to students because I think, once you go away as being a Gateway student, you still have access to it. Although it's important to note that your license keys that you get for whatever version you download from Azure will still work into the future, but it will always be tied to that version. Community versions, any versions of Visual Studio that come out, always keep in mind that they're always attached to major Windows releases. It's not like an accident why it comes out. So when 2015 came out, it's because Windows 10 was coming out. And when 2017 came out, is because Windows 10 really had a new build and they released it. And 2019 came out, well, yeah, there's another new build that came out. It also ties into the server versions, usually, so it's Windows 10, Windows Server 2016, and Windows Server 2019. But Windows actually has a brand new version as of May. I don't know if you guys realize that. It's called the 1903 build, which I'm not too crazy about, but because it can break some things on older equipment. All right, so if you don't have Visual Studio, obviously you're going to need to get it installed. And I wouldn't install 2015 at this point. I'd go up to 2019. And now we're here. So 13 minutes into the video, we're finally getting to the part that we need. So we are going to begin by starting from scratch. So some of the stuff that's going to happen here will require that we take whatever we build and then do it in the next chapter. And what I call them in this book is I call them sections. So I'll say section 4 will be the tutorial. Our first goal tonight is to get through sections 4 through 8. And if we can get that far, I'll be very happy leaving here. So that's kind of our goal. The way that they do it in this document is they have you go step by step. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to be taking this document most of the time and pulling it off to the other screen and just reading from it. If it's helpful for you, what I would recommend is that you find maybe a second screen if you're sitting in front of 2 computers if possible, to have the PDF open for yourself so you can refer back and forth to it as well. But I will call out page numbers and step numbers as a reference if it's not up on screen. So I think that's pretty helpful for the online people. So I'm going to move this over to screen number 2 where you guys cannot see it, but I can. And we're going to begin with the first step, and the first step is to open Visual Studio. So let's go ahead and do that if you don't have it open. This semester I am working with Visual Studio 2019, although it's very comparable to the previous version. So I have the splash screen up, and what they would like us to do, per the instructions say open Visual Studio, click File, New, Project Menu option. Okay, so basically that's the equivalent of creating a new project by clicking this. If you don't want to follow the splash screen approach, you could just say continue without code, go to the File menu, go to New, and bring up Project, but folks, it brings up the same thing. So I don't see the functional reason to do that. So I'm going to go ahead and click New Project. And then just to point out what they would like us to build, we have to be really careful because the screen that they show matches up with the older versions of the creation interface, where I'm looking at like the new version of it here. So let's see how much I can side by side it. But if you were working with 2015, 2017, or older, really, that the interface that you see on the right is what you're going to have available to you. For the most part, you probably don't want to mess with the .NET framework. It'll usually push whatever the newest one is, and you know, for most reasons, you'll choose that. If you're in an environment where you know that you don't want to deliver to that framework, then you can downgrade it. The other thing that you should be mindful of is that we are working in C# as a back-end language, so make sure that you select templates that match. And if you're using the old-fashioned interface, you should choose C# and then Web in order to get to the ASP.NET stuff correctly. So I'm moving this back over and kind of recentering that. So just to go through the steps of it, choose C# as your language, right? Your platform, of course, is Windows, and then the project type is Web. Same thing that we saw in that other interface, and then it will narrow down your choices. Now, the mistake that a lot of people are making, if they're making one, is some people are choosing that core web application, and that is the cross-platform version, and I know I've said that in my videos already this semester. And while that's really cool, it doesn't have the MVC stuff in it in the way that we need it, so we can't really quite use it at this point. However, I have really high hopes in the future that they do get some of that stuff in there, and we'll be switching over to it. Maybe it'll take another 5 or 10 years, the way Microsoft's going, but at least they have their head turned towards open source, and I appreciate that. If you happen to load this up on a Macintosh, that's pretty much the only library that's available to you. But you can do web work in it, so hey, it's a great IDE, so there it is. All right, so what we are going to choose is the web application built on top of the .NET framework. That's pretty critical because it's that .NET framework that makes all the MVC stuff work. Go ahead and click Next. And then they would like us to name our application. So what they're suggesting is this: MVC First App. If you want to call it that, that's great. I'm also not a huge fan how the new version tries to put my stuff in a kind of a centralized folder that doesn't work with my file management approach. So I'm going to be going and placing this in my Google Drive, and you guys are probably getting sick of me talking about the cloud storage, but it really is a smarter way to work for a lot of reasons. So I have my folder here where I'm going to put this. Okay, so this is where we've been working so far. So I'm selecting this root folder of fall 2019 inside my ASP.NET 2 folder. I'm leaving the box checked that says place the solution and project in the same directory. For the limited complexity of our application so far, that's really the appropriate choice. We'll stick with the framework that they recommend, and then I'm going to go ahead and click Create. And then we get to this screen here. So now I'm down on page number 11 in the tutorial document, right at the top, step number 5. And they don't want us to choose MVC. And that's what we've chosen so far for the work that we've done, and it did a lot of work automatically. But we are actually going to choose empty, and as it says, it's not going to include any stuff in there. Okay? However, we do want to include folders and core references for MVC. So it will create a view, a model, and a controller folder, and a couple of other little tidbits. Okay, so make sure you select those. I'm also going to unselect, at least at this point, the configure for HTTPS. Now, if you were really building an application for deployment, and if it had any sort of login, registration, transacting of data, of any, with any privacy concerns, you would want to enable that. But it does add a lot of overhead, and right now, you know what? I'm not going to do that. The other thing that you should notice that's kind of interesting, have you guys ever heard of this product, Docker? Do you guys know what that is?
Database?
Good guess. Docker is actually an application that you can run on non-Windows platforms, so like on a Linux box or a Mac OS, that allows you to run Windows programs natively within it.
Okay.
So, in other words, if you were working on Visual Studio running inside of Docker on a Mac, you could click that box, and then that would help the program you're creating also run in that environment. And some people do that. So I just like to point it out. We're not worried about unit testing or anything like that right now. There's no authentication that we need to worry about either. So if you've got that all selected, go ahead and click Create. All right. Now, because we're not building out a whole lot of stuff, it shouldn't take too long. And last week I was struggling a lot with this power management remote control software that my network admins here had on my laptop, really slowing down my performance. And I'm happy to say that's been removed from my system. So you see how fast that was this time? Last week we would have been here for another 5 minutes, I think, doing the same thing. You can see we have the package manager console screen here on screen too. I'm actually going to close that, but that's something that I brought up last time when we were working. So I'm actually, we got an error message here. It says the solution MVC first step has been modified outside the environment. Press reload to load the updated solution from disk, plus ignore to ignore the external changes. I'm going to click ignore. Because I haven't done anything in here, I'm not sure what it would be pointing to, frankly. So I'm just going to continue my work is basically my approach. On the right-hand side of the screen right away, you are going to notice that it did create a lot of the same folders that we're used to seeing right over in the Solution Explorer. So we still have a models, a views, and a controllers. You will notice by the fact that the controllers folder does not have a little expando arrow to the side of it. There's nothing in it. Models also has nothing in it. Views, however, does have something in it. So let's just go in there really quick and see. And all it has is a web config file. I clicked on it. You can see it's just an XML file. And it's important to note that's a separate web config file than the one that's in the root of your project here. Okay, 2 different web config files. So if you're ever asked to edit that, you got to be mindful of which one you're editing. I'm just pointing it out. Okay, so just so you're aware. Up in the app start folder, you're going to see that there is some route configuration stuff in C#. That's there. This is not anything that we created, but it does set up that default route architecture that we were starting to learn last week. So I don't know if you guys remember that much, right? But we were learning that you can control your controller in your application via the URL. Little did you know, because we didn't talk about this, is that there's actually a format for it that's preset in your application, and that's right here. So inside the app start folder is this route config C# file that sets up the mapping for those URLs right here. So if I wanted to change that somehow, I could come in here and tweak that. Isn't that interesting? And I forget if there's any exercises in this thing where we do that. I think there might be where we tweak one of them. But for the most part, most developers would not ever touch this. But I'm just pointing it out to you that if you had some sort of a intrinsic need to do it, it is absolutely possible. It's not something that's locked out. And some people do that basically to secure their applications and not having a predictable pattern, or they have some custom needs where they're working inside of somebody else's application to leverage their code. So that's one of the reasons you might be in there. So a part of what we just did is just to familiarize you with the fact that we are looking at a similar architecture that we did before. So now it's time to actually go on to the next step here. Now, one thing you'll notice is they want you in step number 6, this is the bottom of page 12, to run this application. And what they say is go to debug, start debugging, which is the same as pressing the play button, right? So go ahead and press the play button and let it build out the application. And they're already telling you in step number 6, you will get an error message. It'll say 404 not found. And why is it doing that? Because you haven't built anything yet, right? Thank you very much. The previous times that we've done this, we let it like build a page for us and a whole structure, right? And we were using Bootstrap and we just latched onto it, and that was all well and good. But there's probably a really strong chance that you might not want to use Bootstrap, or you might not want to use that pre-built Microsoft setup, and that's okay. Building this out harms nothing, right? Now mine doesn't say, it doesn't lead with a 404 error, but if you actually look really close, it does say HTTP 404, which means it's not found, right? This is nothing to panic about. We are expecting this. And that can be a typical pattern in a lot of tutorials, frankly, folks. So you need to be used to that. So a lot of times, like when you do tutorial kind of stuff, what they'll do is they'll show you the wrong way to do it, show you the errors that you get, and then they fix it. And some students get a little frustrated with that approach, but I just want to fair warn you that this document does a bit of that as you go along. All right, so now we're at the bottom of page 13 on step 1. And it's telling us that if we want to get rid of that error, we need to add a controller, because we need something that's going to handle the request from the browser, from the client, to put stuff up on the screen. So we're going to go to the controllers folder like we've done before, and we're going to right click, and then we're going to choose add, and right at the top of the list you should have controller. If you don't, you're not right clicking on the right folder, basically, because it'll give you at the top of that list whatever is the default for that folder. So now we come up on this screen here, and I'm hoping you guys are both good. Okay. All right, so now this dialog that we're looking at, notice that the top left corner of that dialog box, so what does it say there? It says add scaffold, right? And we haven't talked about this much, but scaffolding, especially when we get to the point where we're dealing with data, creates this really powerful feature for us. We can build out a lot of common features without us really intervening. It's just a matter of what we're trying to do. Right now, we're just trying to get something up on the screen, so we're not doing anything fancy. So we're going to choose the first option, which is an empty controller. All right? Go ahead and click add. It'll bring up a little box and ask you to name it. Now there are conventions, right, in MVC, and one of the conventions is that your home controller is called home controller, which also ties into usually to your home page, and that's the typical pattern. All right, it's going to take a few seconds to build that out. There's not a lot of stuff to scaffold, so it doesn't have to build a lot of code. By default, it will create an index method inside there to basically respond to, a generic call to a page. And we've seen this before, so it's nothing new. but the public class gets nested inside of a namespace. And remember, namespaces are just Microsoft's way of like uniquely identifying code, just in case you happen to be having a few MVC applications, all with home controllers. The namespace gives it one other layer of unique identifiers to help make it unique, basically. All right, so this is the C# page that we now have. All right, so we need to do a little bit of tweaking in order to make this work. So the simplest thing we can do is we're going to have this method change from an action result to a string. So we're going to do string output, and you have to change the output type there. And then here, as we've done in the past, just to get this working, let's get something in there. So they do hello world, and you can type whatever stuff you want, honestly, just as long as it works. And that's highly subjective, but that's what I'm typing into mine. All right, I'm going to save my work, and then I'm going to hit the play button. So we're on step number 5 now on page 16, which is to run the application. And hopefully, if you did it right, it shouldn't take too long. There's a lot of processing happening here. It should pop the message up on the screen. All right. All right. Okay, so for those of you working at home or watching the video, since we're basically doing the homework for you, right? You may as well take a screenshot right now. And you don't have to screenshot the whole browser window, by the way. You could probably just kind of grab this little corner of it. That's fine. And then when you come back to Visual Studio, of course, you can probably grab a majority of this screen here, and that'll show me that you did the work. Okay, so make sure you screenshot as you go is kind of the tip here. So you should have a document running and screenshotting along the way. And I'd say that's probably our first real significant step worthy of screenshotting. I mean, that's kind of the way I'm seeing it. So take that with a grain of salt. If you want to add some comments in, that's beautiful. Okay, that actually completes the first section. So section 4 is complete. Basically, get in there, create a controller, return a string, and get it to run. All right, I'm going to bring the tutorial document back over just to do a little lecture kind of stuff here before we start doing our next exercise. All right, so they like to talk here a little bit about how applications kind of have this life cycle. And this is creating an MVC application is a little bit different than what you've done in the past in a couple of ways. We're dealing with server-side code here, so we're actually building an application that has, ultimately, because it runs C# code, C# code needs to be compiled on the server running it in order to dish out the web pages and make them work. So if you have any C# stuff going on at all, and you can see even with the most simple one, you do. So it will not work like a traditional static web application or even a PHP application. Because if you think about PHP is still what we call an interpreted language. It does not compile on the server. It is like JavaScript. It executes on the server, but it's not turning into bytecode, right? It's just running a set of instructions, interacts with the servers and the databases, and sends stuff back to the screen. ASP.NET applications are a little different because they actually do compile, and in order for them to run on the web server, you build your application and you start it. And that's kind of what the bottom graphic is about. So once I get it built and it's what it is, and I hit that play button and it's running, right? First of all, you would never launch it from Visual Studio. Let's get that straight. They have a separate mechanism inside Windows IIS, Internet Information Service, that allows you to take that code and run it, build it, and run it as an application within the web server. And then once you hit that start button, it's running. And hopefully it doesn't go down, right? And you know what? You don't like have to mess with it. If it's running and it's working the way it's supposed to work, you just leave it running. And then the whole point here with the request lifecycle is the way that we're used to thinking about web pages is more the second approach, especially from a static standpoint, where if you take like a regular web page, it's just a bunch of files sitting on a server somewhere, and really all you're doing is asking for those pages, and then they come back to you. If you happen to have some back-end code like PHP or whatever, then it might be doing some database interactions, but it's not all that intense, frankly. Where it gets intense is when it really is a full-blown compiled application like this, and it does have some advantages to the other approach. So it's I think it's kind of interesting. But when it comes to actually how it works on the back end, there's a little bit of stuff like this going on. Somebody's sitting at their computer screen, that's the requester, right? So you land on a site, web page, whatever you want to call it, an application, and you're going to be faced with screens that you're going to interact with. So whatever those screens may ask you to do. You might fill out a form, you might log in, you might make a couple of selections, or maybe even just simply click a link in your document. At that point, your request is routed to the correct controller. So it looks at the URL and it figures out which controller am I going to. The controller will receive it, and it will know from the standpoint of the URL if there's no methods being called or parameters being passed, I'm going to run the index method. Whatever that is, that's what I'm doing. But if there are methods or parameters being passed, then it tries to figure out what is the action that actually needs to be executed. Now, the code that we've seen so far is pretty simplistic. And really, a lot of the code that we're going to do in here is simplistic. But you could see very easily that any of those methods could get pretty complex and in turn call other methods, right? So they could run all sorts of business logic, if you will, or whatever decision statements you might have, or perform a bunch of math or whatever. And then ultimately, whenever that finishes, there's going to be some sort of a result that will either get pushed to a view engine to get incorporated with the view, or to be executed in some method. So for example, like if you were logging in, the result is, okay, you're logged in. And it says so, right? So then you can log out. If some math is being done, it will compute that and then trigger it back into the view engine. So maybe what you did will necessitate the generation of a different type of view, or maybe it's going to be the same view regenerated with the results in it. It just depends on how you design it. But that's what they're talking about in this graphic up top here, is that request lifecycle. So that the weird part is there's little tidbits when you get past the controller level, because when you do action execution, it can really leverage a lot of different stuff. So the one thing it can leverage is interfacing with your data. Okay, so it could read data from a database, write data to the database, pull in something from a text file, or what have you. It might not need to do any of that. Might also need some additional tools. So like if we use authentication, for example, that's just a plugin of sorts. So we just go out to that, it does the authentication for us, and it brings us back. It really depends on, frankly, the logic of what you're trying to accomplish, and then the complexity of your application will grow. All right, so here we are now, step number 6, and that is the routing part of it. And this is where that URL piece comes into play. Notice that they're having us look at a file here. So what file is this? All right, this is the global ASAX file that's part of your app. And what that does is it does register routes on a route table. Now remember that file that we looked at, the route config file? What I like that they do here is they lead with this in terms of how the technology works. And I like that as an approach because often books like this will kind of like keep you away from this stuff a little bit until you know how to code a little bit, and then they show it to you, so you maybe have your aha moment. But their thinking here is that you guys should know enough about coding already if you're doing a document like this, that you'll appreciate seeing it up front. The whole point really is that you understand that the URL is really designed to behave like this. So anything that comes after your machine name, so whatever.com / the first thing after the slash is your controller. If no controller is given, right, so there's nothing after, because usually you don't like type something after somebody's website name. The default, and that's what this part is about, is the home controller with the action being index, if that's not declared, and the parameter being, well, optional. It says right there. So if I don't declare anything aside from, let's say, whatever.com, it implies we're going to the home controller, and it implies that we're loading index, because we didn't specify it, so it just goes to the defaults. Now, could you change those? Yes, you could. In fact, some people use that as a strategy for securing their applications by taking their default controller, not naming it home, because then people don't know how to attack it, right? And they change the default action away from index to something else. It doesn't really matter. You can control it. But the default is, these are the defaults. And you know what? In my mind, it's like, why change them? Kind of breaks the whole thing of convention over configuration. But same thing I showed you before, just to kind of help demystify it a little bit. The routing system, now we've seen it already. If you just hit the root URL, it brings up the index method, whatever is specified inside of it. However, you could also type in, and you could test this, mine's still running, I could type in home with a slash, it should bring up the same thing. And I could type home/index, and it should bring up the same thing. It just so happens that those are the defaults that are implied. The one thing to very clearly remember is that is not a folder and file structure. That's off the table now. It's not what we're doing here, right? You learn your Web 1 stuff, you learn all that, and you learn, well, that's just file and folder, I know my way around. Now you're here, and it's like it has nothing to do with it. And it's a little uncomfortable at first. That's okay. All right. They show that it works. I would suggest that you guys try that too, if you want. All right. They give an example here of somebody that's customizing it, and notice that because maybe their application doesn't do anything aside from have one controller, they call it process. Everything goes to that. So they take away the curly bracket part, and they just force in the root of the URL. Everything is going to go through process. And the default action for them is list stuff, not index. So whatever the list method does, that's their default. And then finally they have the ID parameter. Very easy to customize. All right, now they talk about how the routing engine kind of like functions. So they show a revised version of this, and then they also show the fact that you can actually revert it back at the same time. So they kind of show you both approaches, but for some things you do hard code them in. So if somebody types process, you want to direct them specifically to a certain thing, and you as the coder have that. Now of course if we ran this, and no, this is part of your assignment, you're supposed to run it and get the error page, you'll know that it's not going to work because you don't have that defined, right? You don't have a controller named process, do you? So would you expect to get anything on the screen? And this is the technique that they use. So this is one of your steps, so you guys unfortunately do have to type it in and screenshot it. So if you want to take a second to do that while I'm blabbing away, please do. You know, I suppose no harm done. I could probably always run it too, right? Just to show you. It also shows you that even if you, let's say, went to through the process, code someone say, of typing this in, and maybe even through the process of routing it, it still needs to have the controller present in order to make it work. That's another one of the takeaways here. Now, they are asking us to do this stuff, so, all right. Notice that here, they added some code, right? I'm actually going to go into that route config file and drop that in. You guys with me? Even though they didn't list this as a step. So I'm going back to Visual Studio. I've copied this right from the document now. And I'm going to go to the route config file. And then right above all the defaults here. Oh, of course I can't do that while it's running, so I got to hit stop. I guarantee you'll do that about 20,000 times during this class. And I'm just dropping the code in. It didn't come in with the same exact layout, but it's easy enough to clean it up. The page number on this is page 23. All right, so we're just adding a thing for the process controller as a route. All right, then we came down here, we ran it, it didn't work, right? But now to make it work, we're going to add the process controller. That's the step we're on right now. Oh, yeah, where you're adding that code in, it's actually inside the method, right above the pre-existing one. And then what I always like to do too is, I guess I should probably go back to the document really quick here and just make sure there's no other changes that I'm missing. No, it looks okay otherwise. All right, so we ran it, and now we're going to do this step number 2. Moving this back over to screen number 2, you guys. All right, so in the controllers folder, you are going to want to do a right click again, choose add controller. Once again, we're going to choose empty. Just working with basics right now. Say add, and this one will be called process. Go ahead and click add, and it will build it out for you. And here's our controller. We aren't going to do anything too fancy here again. We're just going to output a string. But I want you to watch really carefully here, because what is happening now, just looking at this config file, right? For the process controller, we are going to require that the root of the URL is called process. And then notice what the default action is here. It's not index, right? So we're going to change the name of our index method in the process controller to list. And not only that, but I'm also going to change the output type to string. So I'm going to say string, list, and parens. And then, of course, we're just going to type up a silly little string for right now saying this is the process page, just to show you that it's working. Now, if you've done all that, go ahead and do a save all, and then hit the run button. I'm going to go ahead and do that. And then they want me to test the URL by appending to the end of it. I'm going to let this load up first. So it should load up my index page by default, right? Because we didn't change that. That's still going to work. So let's let it do that. I only kind of wish it was doing it about 10 times faster. But given the performance boost from last week, I'm pretty happy this week. All right. So I'm going to do /process and then /list. All right, and I'm calling it directly. And, oh, I'm getting an error. So I have to see what I did wrong here to make this fail. You got the same there, and I have a suspicion as to what I did. I think it skipped a step. And frankly, I don't think the step was clearly marked. All right, so here's what I'm doing. I'm going to close the browser window, and we're just going to kind of backtrack just a little bit. So the first thing I'm going to look at is the route file, and I'm going to make sure that we put that code in the right place. So in my tutorial document, I'm back up on page 23, and I'm just double checking that all my stuff is identical. And you know what? It looks fine. However, we had some other stuff that they were showing us too. Remember that? And that was in the global ASAX file, which is this one. So I'm back up on page, right at the beginning of section 6 now. So this is page 19. Okay, I'll bring it back over so you can see where I'm at. So right at the top of section 6, they started talking about the global ASAX file. So I now have that up on my screen here. And I'm just afraid that maybe they made some changes in here. And so I'm looking for route config, register routes, route table routes, area registration, register all areas. That looks the same to me. And I don't see any other issues here. All the calls to the libraries are identical. The code inside the file is identical. So now what I think I need to do, frankly, is go back to this file and make sure I did the route config okay. And I thought this is one of those things, I thought I did it just right. Okay, so Javier, you're hitting on it. So what do you're saying they're conflicting?
They probably could be because of the one's action index and one's action list.
Okay. So maybe, how about this? How would we test this?
Maybe just get rid of one and see if the other works.
All right, so we could use like a CSS style comment, right? Oops. You just comment this out. And I'm going to save it. Let's run the application again and see if this makes it work now. Should we take bets? Will this work or will it not? Well, one thing that's going to happen now is something a little strange, and that is when it loads up, we're going to get an error because there's no index page, right?
Yeah.
Right. It can't even find anything. However, that does not mean that we can't type in our particular URL, right? Process list. Still not working though. Right. So now, oh, I'm sorry to hear that. So now we need to go back and do a little more troubleshooting to try to figure it out. So my suspicion is this isn't the problem. What might be the problem though is the format of this statement. Now, do you notice how this one's laid out? How we have basically sort of like a JSON style list of key value pairs here. And we don't have that going on up here. So here's what I'm going to suggest. It's not flagging it as being wrong. However, maybe, I'm just putting it out there, maybe if we did this, it might magically work. Now, I did copy and paste that straight out of the book. Bless you. And there's also some issues that happen when you do that. One thing you always have to watch for when you're like copy pasting out of like something else is those double quotes not coming in as smart quotes. That didn't happen here, but I'm just telling you that.
Yeah, that might have happened for me because when I do copy and paste, kind of all looks jangled up or something.
Right. So worst case scenario is that you just type it in. I don't anticipate that to be our issue here though, but I am going to try this new approach. And here's another tip for you. When you do this type of thing, you don't want to make multiple changes at once and see if that was the fix. Because then you won't really know what actually fixed it. So I'm fixing this first, or I'll say adjusting it first. And now I'm going to try it as is. So let's see if this solves that issue. So I'm going to relaunch the app. Okay, so now at least it loads the index page, right? Process, list. Still not working. So now in my mind it should work, right? We do have a controller for it. So now I'm going to go to the controller. I didn't misspell it, right? List is spelled correctly. And all it's returning is a string, so I don't understand why it's not doing that. Do you notice also that as we created this, there is a view folder for process, right? There's one for home too, but there's no pages inside of it. But it automatically creates it for you. Okay, I'm going to try a couple of things here, you guys, just so that that you're aware. And I have some concerns that this code. Oh, and you know what? I see the error already. You want to see what the error is? Take a look at process. Oh yeah, can't change code while it's running. You notice that how there's an extra space in there? Take a look at list. You notice how there's an extra space in there?
Yeah.
This is the copy-paste problem. Come back to haunt us. What bet would you like to make that it's going to work great now? Right, because those are string literals, right? It was actually looking for the space. So it's always those silly little things that get you, and that's why it's always not a good idea to copy-paste code, especially when you go from like a PDF, you know, because where they're doing whatever they can to make it look good in print. All right, and let's see if this is the fix. Okay, not bad, right? So it went right to the list page, even though I didn't even type list, but it should work with all three. See how simple the fix was? And I apologize that I didn't like instantly see it, because I like to think of myself as having a built-in debugger in my brain, but it doesn't always work that way. All right, so hopefully you guys were able to get it to work like this, and it just shows you how particular the code is, really. I'm going to go ahead and turn this off, and go back to Visual Studio. But just the fact that we had that extra space in here, you know, and I'm like, I apologize, I didn't see it right away. I wonder if last time I recorded this video, if it did that. So I'm going to guess that even dropping in the name and the URL thing probably did nothing. It was all about that extra space in there. That's all it took to break it, and that's all it took to fix it. So those are string literals, so they were looking for the space in both to make them work. Pretty simple fix though, if you don't need it. All right, so if you got that to work with the process controller, then we're moving on to section 7 already. And with this section, you know, the topic is controllers, so we're kind of going to ramp up on that knowledge a little bit on what we have. So we're actually going to close this project. I'm going to go up to the File menu here and choose Close Solution. If you're still running, remember to hit that Stop button up here first. But I'm going to choose Close Solution because the instructions for Section 7 are asking us to build a new project. So we're going to do exactly what it's asking. So I'm back to the splash screen here. So I'm going to go ahead and choose Create New Project. We're going to make the same options that we made last time, and that is ASP.NET Web Application with the .NET Framework with C# as the back-end language. And if you didn't change any settings, that should be popping up for you pretty easily. If you're using an older version of the software, just remember to navigate that tree on the left-hand side. So go to C# and then Web, and then you should be able to find this. Remember, don't choose Core, choose .NET. Go ahead and click Next. Actually, they want us to change the name of this to MVC Controller Demo. If you named it something else, whatever. Yeah, you know what? Doesn't matter. If you called it Unit 4, Part 1, or whatever, cool. Just as long as you can find it. I'm once again putting it on my Google Drive. You guys put it wherever you think is appropriate for yourself. Go ahead and click Create. We are once again going to choose an empty structure. We are going to pre-select the MVC folders and references. I'm going to uncheck HTTPS because we just frankly don't need it. And I know that it's hard to see up here, but like after I click out of, you know, I select this first option and I click over here, then this seems to unselect, but I assure you on my screen it still looks selected. That's why I'm clicking back on it. And then go ahead and click Create. Okay, now that the application built itself out a bit here, it's time to move on to the next significant step, and that's going to be step number 6 at the bottom of page 29. And it's doing this thing to me again, you know, and I'm just choosing Ignore each time. I'm not sure what it's updating outside the project, but it's certainly nothing that I'm doing, so I'm ignoring it. Okay. Next thing we're going to do is step number 6, bottom of page 29, and that is to add an employee controller. So we're going to go to the controllers folder, right click, choose Add, and select Controller. We are once again going to start with an empty one. Go ahead and click Add, and this will be called Employee. And then choose Add. And that'll go ahead and scaffold out the structure for us, which isn't much of a structure, but there it is. Alright. Now we're also going to add a custom route for this particular controller. So what we're going to do is we're going to take the code at the bottom of page 31 and we're going to insert that into our application. This is real similar to what we did before with the process thing, and I'm trying to copy it out of my PDF here, and I'm really mindful this time about those extra spaces. That's not a mistake I'm going to make twice. So here, to find that route config, remember that's under app start, route config right here. Once again, I'm going to insert this above our defaults. So I'm going to put it right here. Checking for extra spaces. I don't see any. So I'm not going to touch it. I'm leaving it just like that. Notice I'm not throwing in name colon, URL colon. I'm just kind of leaving it. And you guys should realize that these are just parameters that are being passed. And what they are is based upon their position within the parameter call, or argument, if you will. Some people may opt to kind of restructure this just for appearance sake. They might, choose to kind of put it in the code like this. If you think that looks better, that's fine. It has no functional difference on the execution of the program. Right. The next thing that we need to do is we need to also adjust the actual controller file. So go ahead and, if you haven't saved this file, the route config, go ahead and save it. And then I'm going to jump back over to the employee controller file that we created earlier. Now, if you look at the route, there's a little bit of a hint here, right? So the controller we just created is employee, and then the second part here is actually going to be a name. It's expecting, really what it is, the action parameter is going to be search, and we're going to be sending a string, basically, to this thing in the form of a search. So when we type like whatever our application is .com/employee/ name in plain text, it will look that employee up. That's kind of what it's going to trigger. So back in the controller file, in order for that to work, we are going to need to change index to search, and then we also have to set it up to receive a string, which we're going to call name. Inside this method, we're going to add a variable. Call it whatever you want. I'm going to call mine input because that's what the book does. And then we're going to run this method here to parse the name so that somebody is not trying, once again, to inject code into our application. That helps to eliminate that issue. And instead of returning a view at this point, we're going to return whatever we captured in that variable. So get this stuff typed in and then save your work. I'm going to go ahead and run mine. Remember, this stuff is in the PDF also, so you can pull it back in, so you can always rewind the video and go back to it. But I'm going to go ahead and do that next step here. Now, we did not build an index method into this, right? Or home controller. So what's going to pop up first?
Server, the front slash.
Yeah, it should give you an error message, right? And that shouldn't be a surprise. If you're uncomfortable with that, you could add a home controller with an index method, right? So we're just letting it do its thing. All right. But now the point of this is, now that it's running, is we should be able to type in employee. It's got to spell it right though. Then a /, and then any string that's a person's name. I'm just going to put my first name in, and it should echo it back. All right. That, folks, completes section 7. So this is a good spot to pause the video and do some screenshots, if you will. All right, I'm going to bring the document back over to the screen here, and we're going to talk about this little bit before we code anything out. And we're going to talk now about some of the actions that we can take. And mind you, this is like kind of on a simplistic level, but so you get kind of like a feel for what's going on here. All right. So the main tool that we usually use inside of an MVC engine are the action results that happen, or what we call the action methods inside of the controllers, which trigger all the things happening. They show you here kind of, the hierarchy of how this works. Like when you call in a particular URL, and we figured out home is the controller, index is the method, and some of the routing tools that kind of kick in to help the work get done. The thing that's kind of interesting about this is there's more than just the simple things that we've been doing so far. And notice that we just called in content, right? Just the word, it was a method, content, and we threw into it a string that we stored in a variable, and it put it back out on the screen. Notice that there's a bunch of other type of actions that we can use as well, and that depending on the kind of data you're interacting with or the file system you're interacting with, you're going to get a whole different collection of things that you might be able to do. But this is some of the real common ones that you might use in creating an application. So they're going to kind of leverage on this employee controller that we've already built. So this is the work that we've done so far, and you can see that we're actually doing an action result. And what does that mean? That means we're returning a certain type of thing. Before we were returning a string, so if we were returning a string, what we're sending back out would have to be indicated here. If it's string, or maybe it's just an integer or whatever. In this case, we're returning an action result, and content happens to be one of those. It's the top one on the table here. Okay, so that's kind of the tie-in if you're wondering. All right, and then it showed you how it works. We got that to work, hopefully. All right, so now we're going to go ahead and add another controller. So we're using the same application from the previous section, so hopefully you still have that open. If not, you'll want to go back and open that one up. And once again, I'm going to move the book out of the way so I can kind of look at the instructions and do my work at the same time. And now we're going back to the controllers folder. Oh, I'm noticing that my application is still running, so I'm going to terminate it from running. Back over to controllers and right click and choose add controller. Once again, we're selecting empty and go ahead and click add. And this one's going to be called customer controller. All right. The file, C# file will open up. and they want us right away to adjust this. Oh, I guess I'm missing a step here. Oh, I almost jumped right past it. So they also want us to add in a home controller, because we haven't done that yet, right? And that's a real common one. So I'm going to right click, add controller. Same thing we've done before. We'll stick with empty. We'll call it home. And then we're going to change the home controller. Once it comes up, we're just going to replace it with a string output, and then we're going to dictate what the string is. Now, one thing that as you type in these strings, keep in mind, you can drop any HTML in here that you want, right? So far we've just been like actually throwing text on the screen, but who's to say you couldn't do like, you know, H2 or something, and that should all be lowercase, by the way. And this is the home controller. Duh. Not duh, but you know, if I had a whole bunch of HTML to stick in here, I could have like the entire structure of a page in here, really, right? Right. I don't know why you would do that, since you have views that you can use, but you can drop in any valid HTML, that'll work. So I'm just trying to have a little fun with it. I'm going to go ahead and save this, because it's asking me to, in the book, and go ahead and run this application, and just make sure that when it launches now, it should go right to the index page when it launches. And this time, instead of tiny little text you'll have a hard time reading, you should actually be able to read it a little bit larger, provided it loads up, which it is just about to. So exciting. There it is. All right, so we have success there. Now I get the impression that they want us to do a little bit more work. So we need to stop the application running again, go ahead and close the window. So we got rid of the one problem, which is when it launches, it actually goes somewhere. But now they want us to add some code inside the customer controller file. So I'm going to go ahead and go to that file, and they want us to add a method inside of here. So right now we have the index method, which just returns a view, right? Which is, you know, nothing at this point. But they want us to add some code. Now you could type this in. In fact, I'm going to start typing it in manually because it actually spans 2 pages, so copy paste isn't going to be the cleanest thing. And they want us to add a method called get all customers. Close your parens, add a set of curlies, split them apart, and now we're going to jump in and do a little bit of output. So here's where it gets kind of interesting. Now, without learning formally about using Razor syntax for output, we're just going to start using it. And here's the beauty of Razor syntax, right? I just put in my @ sign, indicates we're using Razor. Once again, I'm going to split my lines apart here, but I'm just going to start typing an unordered list in plain HTML now, right inside this architecture. I don't know if you want to call it that. And then they're just creating a bunch of list items with people's names. So I'm going to be a little more creative with mine. And they have 4 names on their list, so I'm doing the same thing. What else should I add in here? I don't know. I just saw this movie, so let's put that in there. And then they want you to close the list just like you would with regular HTML. And it's not hard to predict what this is going to do, right? We do need to put a semicolon at the end. That's one little difference. Not hard to figure out what this is going to do. Save your work, hit the play button, and then once the app's loaded up, then you have to type in the URL that matches what we just created. Right? So keep in mind, we created a controller called customers, and then a method called getAllCustomers. Alright, so I'm going to type that in. So, customers, oops, I got a question, not a slash. Customers, or customer, singular, and then get all customers, in camel case, like that. And then hopefully your list pops up. I hope you guys were successful with that. So hopefully everybody got that working. And now we're at the bottom of page 41 in the tutorial in section 7. And what they're going to ask us to do right now is to actually redirect our controller for a scenario that we don't have accounted for. So in other words, what we're going to do is we're going to go to our home controller. So actually we want to close our browser window so it stops the application running. And as I was just telling the people in class, you know, you find a mistake and then you want to like fix it and then you forget it's running and you start typing and then it gives you the error message. And don't worry, you'll probably do that a gazillion times, so nothing to be embarrassed about. We're now going to go to the home controller, and instead of having this silly string here, we're going to actually do a redirect. So we're going to leave the name index, we're going to change this back to action, gotta spell it right though, action result, and try to use the auto type if you can. And instead of returning a string, we are going to return an action. And the action is called redirect to action. And then it's going to give us some parameters we need to pass in. And what we're doing here, and you'll probably catch on as soon as I type it in, here's the method call. And we're basically just sending it to a different controller. So when we land on the root of the application, instead of it putting up a silly message, it's just going to put us right into the customer controller and trigger the getAllCustomers method. So when you're done with that one, go ahead and save. And then run the application one more time. Now what should happen is it tries to load the index page or the root of your site. It's automatically going to redirect to the stuff that we just created. Remember, your client, whoever's viewing your page, is not going to be the one triggering this. You're controlling it. Oh, so much for that idea. Oh, I misspelled it. So, Javier, you caught that right away. Yeah, it's customer, not customers. Okay, so yes, I have to stop it. Got to get rid of that S, save it, and relaunch. And hopefully this time it will work beautifully as intended. But it just shows you that, you know, little details like that can make it not work. So I always check those spellings of the methods and the controllers real carefully. All right, so went right to where I anticipated it would go, which is what we were trying to accomplish. All right, folks, that actually completes that first set of tutorials for sections 4 through 8, which is the first assignment inside Unit 4, I believe it is. And when we come back together next time, we're going to work through the next one together, and then we're going to press into the next unit. I've already released Unit 5, so you guys should be able to access it. And since we will be basically completing all the tutorials in this document, with the exception of, I think, 1 or 2, please feel free to work ahead if the course isn't moving fast enough for you. All right, this video ends here.